I talk about today. At the cross, God was reasoning with man about all their conclusions that they had made about themselves and their life with Him and His thoughts and intentions towards them when He found them in sin and death. He's reasoning with man. He's saying, do you see all the things you thought about yourself because of sin and death? Do you see all the things you thought about me because of your sin and death? We see all the things we concluded about our lives and our lives with God because of our sin and death at the cross. We see all the carnal mind's conclusions about man and God at the cross. And then in the resurrection, we see the mind of Jesus about Himself and God made flesh. And it's the declaration where God says, behold the truth about what I've always thought about you. Behold the truth about who you've always been. Behold the truth about what my thoughts and intentions have always been towards you, even when you were in sin and death. He's reasoning with us through the cross and the resurrection. And why this escapes so many Christians is because we totally lose sight of John's gospel where he says, the Word was made flesh. Like Mo so beautifully just said. We couldn't reason with God because He was speaking spirit and we were carnal. So the spirit word that He was trying to speak to us was made flesh so we could see it. And He begins reasoning with us about what we've concluded about our life and our life with God. Adam came to conclusions about who he was and what God thought of him and what God intended to do with his life. And the foundation from where he made those conclusions was his sin and his death. He made conclusions about that. And we see all those things manifested at the cross. That's why it's so powerful that it says Jesus is our high priest. To be the high priest of a people means that they're the representative of the people. Meaning that you look to them to find what you want to know about yourself. Right? They interpret your story. Like I talked about the B97 thing. Some of you that are my age might have remembered this morning show. It's time for the story guy. You guys remember that on B97? Well, Jesus is the story guy. And He came full of the mind of God, but as a human being. And then, as a human being, He took on the sin and death of all the other human beings, but He kept the mind of God. So, He interpreted the sin and death that human beings found themselves in through the mind of God instead of the carnal mind. So that He could tell us our story. So that He could interpret our lives with God. Because we had written our autobiography. And really we needed a biographer. You know, like somebody like me, I'm not good with English and grammar and that kind of stuff. So if I tried to write an autobiography, it wouldn't be a nice read. It would be jacked up. I need somebody to come in and tell the story. Right? Well, man had tried to autobiograph, whatever word is accurate, their own story with God. But we did it through the carnal mind. We looked at the fact that we ate from the tree. We saw ourselves in sin and death, and then we defined who we were, and we defined who God was, and we judged God's thoughts and intents towards us based on our sin and our death. Based on what we saw manifesting in our flesh, based on what we saw manifesting in the world around us, we judged ourselves, we judged our life, and we judged the thoughts and intents of God towards us. We wrote an autobiography of our story. But we needed a biographer. But we needed that biographer to be from the first person.
Yes.
Otherwise, how could we see it was actually our story? We would just see it was another guy's story. So Jesus is our high priest means He's the representative of the entire human race. The entire human race was in sin and death. He is the Son of Man. As the Son of Man, He takes the sin and death of the world upon Himself. But in that place, He didn't have the carnal mind. He had the mind of the Spirit. And so He filtered what He saw manifesting in His body and all around Him on the cross through the mind of God instead of the mind of the serpent. And so He heard the conclusions of the carnal mind coming against Him at the cross. Guys, those are the conclusions that came against man. The carnal mind looked at man and said, look at that sin and death. You're not the children of God. Look at that sin and death. you are the forsaken of God. Look at that sin and death. God has smitten and stricken you. Look at that sin and death. God has cursed you. Look at that sin and death. God is ashamed to call you his own. God isn't going to come and claim you as his own. You're a fool for trusting God. All those accusations came against man before Jesus ever went to the cross. He went to the cross and stood in the face of all the conclusions that man had come to by themselves apart from the mind of God. And he stood in the face of them, he heard them, he saw them, he felt the weight of sin and death, but he filtered all those things that he felt and he saw through the mind of God instead of the carnal mind. Right? So in doing that, guess what he was able to do? Die away the conclusions of the carnal mind, take them to the grave, leave them in the grave, and come out and tell us those conclusions were never true. They were always a lie. Behold the truth about who you really are. Behold the truth about what God's thoughts and intentions towards you have always been. You were dead in sin. Where was I when God found me? Dead in sin. Now, you think God left you, and that he was ashamed of you, and that he's the one who put you in the grave. Now, what do you see God came and did to me? He came and claimed me as his own. He came and raised me up from the dead. He came and clothed me in glory and honor, value and worth. He came and clothed me in immortality and life. Now, how does that jive with all the conclusions of the carnal mind? It subverts them. And that's how our minds are renewed.
Yes.
You see? And then we begin living from wisdom and abundance instead of living from fear and lack. You know, imagine what, many times we see a person who we think is smart or we think has it all figured out, and we think, if I could think like them, if I could be like them, we even think, if I could have Einstein's mind, or I could have Da Vinci's mind. Imagine walking through the earth with the mind of Christ. Imagine walking through the earth thinking like God. Imagine being able to discern everything you see, everything you hear, everything you feel through the mind of God. Now, think about how that might impact your life. Think about how that might impact every area of your life. Your job, how you navigate your job, your thoughts about your job, right? Your feelings about your job, your thoughts and feelings about what's going on at your job, your relationships, the thoughts that you have about your relationships, how you navigate your relationships, the way you make decisions, your discernment. Is your discernment born from wisdom and abundance, or is your discernment born from fear and lack? Is your discernment and the way you view things born from I lack life, or is the way you view things born from I have all things that pertain to life? That changes the way you view everything. Sure. And then the way you view things is what's going to cause the way you react or respond.